The quiet town of Cedar Falls, Kentucky, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets were hard to keep. Nestled amidst rolling hills and lush farmlands, it was a community built on trust and tradition. But on the night of October 15, 2015, the facade of tranquility was shattered by a discovery that would forever change the lives of two families. Thomas Parker was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: a successful career as a real estate developer, a beautiful home, and a loving wife, Sarah. Together, they were considered the perfect couple, always seen holding hands at church services or cheering on their children at school events. But as often is the case, the image was only skin deep. Sarah's sister, Emily, was a frequent visitor to the Parker home. Younger by 2 years, Emily had always been close to Sarah, and after a difficult divorce, she had moved back to Cedar Falls to be nearer to her family. It wasn't long before she found herself spending more and more time at the Parker household, lending a hand with the children and becoming a trusted part of their daily lives. To the outside world, Emily's presence was a blessing for Sarah, who often struggled to juggle her responsibilities. But behind closed doors, a dangerous attraction was growing between Emily and Thomas. What began as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into something much darker. But behind closed doors, a dangerous attraction was growing between Emily and Thomas. What began as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into something much darker. Thomas, feeling stifled by the predictability of his marriage, was drawn to Emily's vivaciousness and vulnerability. She, in turn, was captivated by his charm and the thrill of their forbidden connection. Their affair began in secret, with stolen glances and late-night text messages, but it soon escalated into clandestine meetings at a remote cabin on the outskirts of town. For months, they managed to keep their relationship hidden, slipping away whenever they could and covering their tracks carefully. But as the affair intensified, so did the risks. Thomas became more reckless, taking greater chances, while Emily grew increasingly conflicted, torn between her love for Thomas and her loyalty to her sister. The pressure of maintaining their secret began to take its toll on both of them. Emily's guilt was palpable. She was withdrawing from Sarah and distancing herself from the family. Thomas, on the other hand, was growing frustrated with the secrecy. He wanted more than just fleeting moments. He wanted a future with Emily, a life free from the constraints of his marriage. One night, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Thomas made a shocking proposal. He suggested they could be together if Sarah were out of the picture. Emily recoiled at the suggestion, horrified by the implication. But Thomas, consumed by his desire and desperation, insisted that they could make it look like an accident, a tragic but unavoidable mishap. Emily tried to dismiss his words as the ranting of a man driven mad by love, but the seed of a terrible idea had been planted. In the weeks that followed, Thomas continued to pressure Emily, convincing her that they could have the life they both dreamed of if only they were willing to take that one final step. Emily, exhausted by the deception and consumed by her feelings for Thomas, began to waver. The thought of losing him was unbearable, and she convinced herself that Sarah, already unhappy in her marriage, would be better off without the pain of discovering the affair. It was a lie she repeated to herself until it almost felt like the truth. On the evening of October 15th, Thomas called Emily with a plan. He would ensure Sarah was home alone, and then Emily would come over to confront her sister, setting the stage for what he envisioned as the perfect crime, a confrontation that would end in Sarah's accidental death. Emily hesitated but ultimately agreed, her mind clouded by fear and confusion. She arrived at the Parker home just after 9 p.m., her heart pounding as she approached the front door. Inside, Sarah was waiting, oblivious to the storm about to descend on her seemingly perfect life. As Emily stepped inside, she realized there was no turning back. What had begun as a forbidden affair was about to culminate in a night of unimaginable horror. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the doorknob, pushing the front door open. The house was quiet, and the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Sarah was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over her face. She looked up and smiled when she saw Emily, completely unaware of the dark intentions that had brought her sister here tonight. "Hey, Emily, I wasn't expecting you. What's up?" Sarah's voice was cheerful, but Emily could hear the underlying fatigue. It almost broke her resolve, but she reminded herself why she was here. The life she wanted with Thomas was within reach, but she had to see this through. "Sarah, we need to talk," Emily said, her voice shaky. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "It's about Thomas." Sarah's smile faded, and she closed the book, sitting up straight. "What about Thomas?" The words caught in Emily's throat. How could she tell her sister that she had betrayed her in the worst possible way? But then she thought of Thomas, his promises, and the life they could have together. She pressed on, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas and we've been seeing each other. I'm so sorry, but it's the truth. It started months ago, and I don't know how to stop." For a moment, there was silence. Sarah just stared at her, disbelief and confusion clouding her eyes. Then, slowly, the realization dawned, and her expression crumpled into one of utter devastation. "You and Thomas? How could you, Emily?" Her voice cracked, a mix of anger and pain. "How could you do this to me? To us?" Emily took a step forward, reaching out, but Sarah recoiled, her face twisted in grief. "Don't touch me. I trusted you. You're my sister. How could you?" The words hit Emily like a slap. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her mind, but nothing had prepared her for the raw pain in Sarah's voice. The depth of her betrayal laid bare. She wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but there was no going back now. The plan had been set in motion. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for it to happen this way, but I love him. I love him, and he loves me," Emily pleaded, her voice desperate. "We can't go on like this. Get out, Emily. Get out of my house." Sarah's voice was rising now, hysterical. She stood up, her hands shaking as she pointed toward the door. "You've ruined everything. Just get out." But Emily didn't move. She knew she had to keep Sarah inside, had to make her stay until Thomas arrived. He had promised her it would be quick, that they would make it look like a tragic accident, but Sarah's reaction had thrown her off balance. The plan was slipping away from her. "Sarah, please, let's just talk about this," Emily begged, stepping closer. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was frantically searching for her phone, muttering to herself about calling the police, about getting Thomas home. Panic seized Emily as she realized Sarah was serious. If she called the police now, everything would be over. Her mind raced, desperation clawing at her throat. She had to stop her. She had to. Before she knew what she was doing, Emily lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's arm. Sarah screamed, struggling against her grip, but Emily held on, her fingers digging into Sarah's skin. "Stop it, Sarah. Just stop." Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. But Sarah was screaming, thrashing against her, trying to break free. In the struggle, they stumbled backward into the kitchen. Emily saw it then, the glint of the knife on the counter. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as she reached for it, her hand closing around the handle. She didn't want to use it, didn't want to hurt her sister, but the fear of losing everything drove her to the edge. "Please, just listen to me," Emily sobbed, but Sarah's screams only grew louder, her voice shrill with terror. And then, in one terrible, unthinking moment, Emily plunged the knife forward. Sarah's scream cut off abruptly as the blade sank into her side. She staggered, her eyes wide with shock and pain, looking down at the knife protruding from her body. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Oh God, no. Sarah, I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, but it was too late. Blood was spreading across Sarah's shirt, and she was crumpling to the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. Emily dropped the knife, her hands covered in her sister's blood. She fell to her knees beside Sarah, her mind a whirl of horror and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't part of the plan. But as Sarah lay gasping for breath, her eyes locked onto Emily's, she realized there was no turning back. The deed was done, and there was no undoing it. Emily knelt beside her dying sister, her hands trembling as she tried to comprehend what she had just done. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. Blood pooled around her, soaking into the tiled kitchen floor. Emily reached out, pressing her hands against the wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Sarah, please, "Stay with me. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." Her voice broke, tears blurring her vision. But Sarah's eyes were losing focus, her breaths coming slower and slower. Emily could feel her slipping away, her sister's life draining out with every second that passed. The door burst open, and Thomas rushed in, his face pale as he took in the scene before him. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen in shock, before rushing to Emily's side. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "She was going to call the police, Thomas. I had to stop her. I didn't mean to." Emily's words tumbled out in a frantic, incoherent rush. She looked up at him, desperate for reassurance, for him to tell her that everything would be okay. But his eyes were cold, calculating as he surveyed the damage. "We have to get rid of the body. We have to make it look like an accident," he said, his voice firm. He grabbed a dish towel from the counter, wrapping it around the knife handle before carefully pulling it out of Sarah's lifeless body. Emily gasped as more blood gushed from the wound, but Thomas remained focused, determined. He pulled Emily to her feet, his grip tight on her arm. "We don't have much time. Help me carry her to the car. We'll take her to the quarry outside town. It'll look like she fell." Emily's mind was reeling, barely able to keep up with what was happening. She was covered in blood, her sister's blood, and her heart felt like it was going to explode out of her chest. But Thomas's voice was steady, commanding, and she clung to it like a lifeline. Together, they lifted Sarah's body, her head lolling limply against Emily's shoulder. She bit back a sob, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. They carried her out to Thomas's truck, laying her gently in the back seat. Emily's hands shook uncontrollably as she wiped her face, smearing blood across her cheeks. Thomas glanced around nervously before turning back to Emily. "You need to go home, clean yourself up. If anyone asks, you haven't seen Sarah. I'll take care of everything." "But Thomas, just go, Emily," he snapped, his eyes blazing with a desperation she had never seen before. "If we're going to get away with this, we have to be smart. Go home, now." Emily stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. She turned and ran, not daring to look back as she fled down the street. Her mind was a chaotic mess of fear and guilt and horror. But one thought kept repeating over and over in her head. This wasn't supposed to happen. Back at the house, Thomas took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew what he had to do. He climbed into the truck, glancing in the rearview mirror at Sarah's lifeless body sprawled across the back seat. His hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel and drove out to the abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, the place was deserted, the moon casting an eerie glow over the rocky cliffs. He dragged Sarah's body out of the truck, his muscles straining under the weight. He looked down at her, his heart pounding. This was his fault, all of it. But there was no turning back now. With one last, desperate effort, he pushed her body over the edge. He watched as she tumbled down the jagged rocks, her body coming to rest at the bottom, twisted and broken. Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, his mind racing. It looked convincing enough. A tragic fall, a fatal accident. He got back into the truck and drove away, his mind already working on the alibi he would need to sell. But as he sped down the deserted road, a sick feeling settled in his stomach. They had done it. They had committed the perfect crime, or so he thought. 2 days later, a hiker found Sarah's body at the bottom of the quarry. The police were called, and soon the quiet town of Cedar Falls was abuzz with the news. The investigation that followed would unravel everything Thomas and Emily had tried so desperately to hide. It wasn't long before the inconsistencies in their stories emerged. Witnesses had seen Thomas's truck near the Parker house on the night of the murder. Bloodstains in the kitchen couldn't be scrubbed clean, and Emily's frantic behavior aroused suspicion. By the end of the week, both Emily and Thomas were arrested. In the harsh light of the interrogation room, their perfect crime crumbled under the weight of their lies. Thomas was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Emily, charged as an accomplice, received 20 years. Cedar Falls would never be the same. The story of Sarah Parker's tragic death became a chilling reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface.